Right. Okay. Do you guys all get a notification about recording?
Yeah.
All right. That means it's working. Okay. So I want to thank everybody for joining the May 2024 meeting for the Energy Group. Today, I asked Peggy Hall, our the OSU Extension ag attorney specialist. I almost said tax. I'm sorry, Peggy. Ag attorney
Please
specialist.
don't say tax.
Yeah, yeah, coming back from the holidays, and with her as well, we have Mikey Stat, which is the Pickaway County Extension educator. Both of which have been quite involved in the carbon sequestration market, more specifically with landowners. So I asked them to come and give us all an update on some of the things that maybe a landowner might run into, maybe some tips on how to navigate this topic at the landowner. But I'll let you guys have free reign on how you think you want to address it, and how you think it'll help our listeners out there. So Mike and Peggy, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. And Peggy, if it's all right with you, how about I've got 3 segments I was going to talk about, and I would just kind of give an overview, and then could you just follow up on the legal side of or policy side of the 3 things I'm going to talk about?
Sounds
I'm going
good.
to talk about offsets, I'm going to talk about inserts, and then I'm going to talk about carbon intensity. And so I'm going to kind of give you all updates on that, and then Peggy can chime in and help you all on the legal side of those. And so I'll go ahead and start with offsets. Companies are still very active in the Midwest, particularly the Corn Belt, getting farmers, trying to get farmers enrolled in offset markets. I think the last survey data I saw out of Purdue was a lot more encouraging as what it was compared to a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, we were right, maybe around 2% of farmers had entered into offset markets. I think that number's probably exponentially 200% more, but it only really means about 4% or 8% of funds. There's a lot of interest in it, and I guess commodity prices may be driving a little bit of that for farmers looking to find an extra $35 to $45 an acre out there with offsets. So offsets are very, very, still very in the scene. This past week, the Biden administration made an announcement concerning a standardization of the offset market. I just kind of heard this report this morning. There are third-party verifiers out there that work with companies. But I think what I've heard out of the administration here this past week, and as I was listening to the report, is that they want to make sure that the people that are buying the offsets are doing as much as they can to reduce their emissions first. So that's the latest wrinkle. So Peggy, I don't know if you've heard that or not, but sounds like the federal agencies are wanting polluters to do as much as they can first before they can go into the offset market.
Yeah, I think that's all part of that greenwashing frustration that's out there, that they just like to claim they're, zero and they're carbon neutral, but they're not actually doing anything. And then instead they're, buying into this somewhat mysterious, volatile market. So I think that's all related, Mike. I think it's a good trend that we're seeing.
Did everybody see the article that Brent Songen put out a couple weeks ago about why the prices of offsets are so cheap? It's a really good article. How did he send that? Was it all A&R or?
Yeah, even email.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen that, I can share that with you. It's a really good article. And basically the basic premise of the article is the offset market isn't as valuable here in the United States only because of the nature it's a voluntary market. So when it's a mandatory market, then a lot more people have to buy the offsets. And of course, demand is going to drive limited supply, higher demand, higher price. So, I guess as it relates to landowners in particular, I see Clifton and Christine on. A lot of activity still on forestry offsets. There was an announcement, probably been a month ago. One of the companies is offering an additional bonus payment if your woodlots or woodlands are have an FSA farm number. So if you take a little time to go in and make sure that the forestry tracts have an overriding FSA farm number. I think there was a bonus of $10 per acre on carbon offsets related to forestry. So that came out like a month ago. So I know a couple months or like a month ago, AED had a sustainability seminar, and there was the Ohio Nature Conservancy's director was there. I was really surprised to find out they've got almost 22,000 acres of forestry in Ohio in an offset market. So I didn't ask who was the buyer, and I didn't ask how much they got paid, but
Probably wouldn't have gotten those answers anyway.
well, I'm glad I did it, Peggy. I'm glad I did it because everyone's talking about transparency and all this good stuff. And then I find out, I mean, I didn't want to raise my hand and ask that and put the guy on the spot. Then I find out he's on Dean Chris's internal advisory committee. So it was probably a good thing I didn't put him on the spot. So that's kind of the nature of offsets. They're still out there, probably not hugely popular yet. And there's some reasons for that, based on farmers' attitudes towards data sharing, verification, measuring, monitoring, additionality. There's all the same things we've been hearing about the last couple of years. Farmers just are not really excited about offsets. When we talk about insets, that's basically looking at scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. So supply chain, the Climate Smart Commodities program. Again, if you followed any of this, you're probably getting your Twitter feed and your Facebook feed is probably full companies, that are looking at climate smart commodities. And here in Ohio in particular, Accelerate Appalachia is still part of Ohio. I've seen their information out, really geared more towards small-scale farmers, agroforestry, underserved communities, really is the focus of Accelerating Appalachia. Soils Outcome Fund is very active in Ohio. Several farmers I know in this area have signed up with them. DeLong Grain, they're a large company based out of Wisconsin. They were recipients of a Climate Smart Commodity grant. And these grants weren't little. They were like 50, 70, $90 million grants through USDA. We do have a DeLong facility here in Pickaway County. And talking with farmers here again, they're looking for growers to implement climate smart practices, no-till cover crops and such, in order to reduce the carbon footprint on the farm or on the commodity. PepsiCo, General Mills, or an ADM. We do have a lot of ADM facilities here. So they are doing the same thing. They're trying to work with farmers to change some practices on the land in order to reduce their carbon footprint so that, their supply chain will be less carbon intensive. So I don't know, Peggy, have you had a chance I have not seen a contract. I'm not really sure if there is a legal contract with these.
It's just more like a program enrollment form, but that legally tends to meet the requirements of a contract, but they're much different than the carbon agreements, the carbon credit contracts.
Yeah. And I think in its face there is the non-performance part of a offset probably has there's a lot more involved than that as far as suspension of payments if you're on an offset market and you go out until you're filled. As far as these climate smart commodities, what I have seen is like there's really not a big penalty for non-compliance. You just lose the premium, and if there's a premium on the commodity.
Well,
So-
it's a lot easier to measure compliance because they simply implement the practice and they're paid. And paid per acre, not by some, estimate of how much carbon was sequestered. So
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a lot more interest in that approach.
Right. There's two camps here. There's payments based upon performance, and there's payments based upon the practice. And when you think about performance, it's actually measuring the carbon in the ground as a baseline and actually how much are you actually sequestering. Whereas based upon practice, it's right. $3 for no-till, $6 for cover crops, and so forth. So that's
also, Mike, are you seeing in those program approaches, is there less of this concern about double dipping and being in several different programs? I haven't seen that concern as much. So you can do
my understanding, Peggy,
stack.
Correct. Yeah, you're still eligible for other payments on the climate smart commodities. So it's not as stringent as far as so you're not registering your in the registry. So I don't know. Has anyone in the area, anyone talked to growers that have enrolled in any of the climate smart commodity programs?
Mike, I haven't heard of any in the local area, but we also don't do a lot of row crops, which is something you were suggesting is part of this. But we do have a lot of forested systems, which I haven't heard of anyone enrolling in that yet.
Well, there were a lot of those programs. I'm trying to remember. I think there were 70 or 72 recipients and it's nationwide. And a lot of the companies were very umbrella-like in their eligibility and listed a lot of states. There are several folks grazing was one of the major emphasis on the climate smart commodity grants, and Virginia Tech got a very large, I think they got a $70 million grant. And I don't know whether that was going to maybe come up into West Virginia or parts of Kentucky, but climate smart commodities. The one here in Ohio, I guess that's getting most of the detail and most of the attention right now is carbon intensity. And so I'm going to just give you a little bit of a thumbnail of how it's come to be. If you look in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a provision for sustainable aviation fuel. And what is sustainable aviation fuel? Well, the airline industry, again, in order to meet their environmental pledges to reduce their carbon footprints, has made a really effort to buy lower carbon fuel. And so what is lower carbon fuel? It's going to be fuel that there's going to be a documentation of practices that are done on the farm, including but not limited to what the processors of these commodities and what are the 5 commodities or the 5 feedstocks of most interest to be further refined into aviation fuel. So here in Ohio, there's 2, corn ethanol and soy oil. So those are the 2 commodities in Ohio that have both the commodity groups engaged in the potential of sustainable aviation fuel. The other products were canola. Then there was beef tallow and used cooking oil. And when you really look at currently of those raw feedstocks, used cooking oil is the easiest and has the lowest carbon intensity score. And I find it interesting. There is a large sustainable aviation fuel refinery being built in California right now. And they're buying all their feedstocks, the used cooking oil, from China. And Sungee had a slide, I think, this winter, about 80% of the used cooking oil used in this sustainable aviation fuels come from China. And with interest, I saw when the administration had a list of all the, we're going through this, we're going to have tariffs again. There was one product from China that didn't have a tariff on it, used cooking oil. So at least it looks like the administration is really behind the, used cooking oil right now. But corn and wheat growers and the soybean folks here in Ohio, I know Corn Growers has put together a sustainable aviation fuels task force or strike force. I'm going to be on that. There was a 40B provision within the tax code. So these companies are getting tax credits to produce the drop-in fuels that go into sustainable aviation fuel. 40B was the latest one that was announced. And what was interesting, or at least frustrating, I think, for commodity groups is how long this was delayed. What are the rules? For 40B, that was the latest one. The rules were supposed to be out like in March, and they didn't come out until this past month. And I think kind of the IRS and the Department of Energy and all these agencies kind of a little bit kicked the can down the road on this one, because I know that 40B was going to expire on January 1, 2025. So they kind of carte blanche just said, we're not going to have growers actually generate their carbon intensity score this time around. We're just going to say all the corn and soybean, all the corn has to be grown no-till with a cover crop, and you have to use some type of a nitrogen enhancement or stabilizer within your production system. So here in Ohio and across a lot of the Midwest, that's kind of like a unicorn. We don't have a lot of people that are growing corn, no-till, cover crops, and with a nitrogen enhancement product. So I know the corn growers and a lot of the national corn growers and a lot of the folks were a little disappointed in that. But we're going to roll into what's into 45Z, another tax provision here in the next coming years. So corn that's being grown now will be eligible for, or the ethanol plants that create the ethanol will be eligible for the tax credit, 45Z. And that will be a formula. And the formula is what's called the GREET model. It's a greenhouse emissions formula. Department of Energy scores every energy source we have by the GREET model. And so it will come out sometime here within the next year, I'd imagine. And so growers can do things on their farms. And one of course, no-till is going to be part of it. Cover crops will be part of it. Nitrogen enhancement, nitrogen management, manures instead of synthetic fertilizer. It's going to be all encompassing. So 45Z is the next one. So, so carbon intensity is going to be the thing you're going to hear a lot about in the next few months. So, Peggy, I don't know if you've studied very much the tax credits or how, I think I want you to share how you think that's going to be shared with the growers, maybe.
Yeah, well, Ohio Corn and Wheat is trying to deal with that right now and develop a plan for that. And it's not just the growers we're concerned about, it's the ethanol plants too, being part of that bigger picture and the sustainable aviation fuels component there. I think it feels to me like it's a bit of a state of uncertainty and a lot of scrambling going on right now. And I think we'll see something here, especially with the election coming and possibly, the ending of those credits. And we'll see something real soon where there's going to be a bit of a race going on to get to qualify and get those in place. But you're right, the carbon intensity score is very much related to that, and that's not looking very promising for some of our ethanol plants.
So like in most cases, seed stock, what the feedstock makes up about 25% of an ethanol plant score right now. So the thing that can really lower your score really quickly if you're an ethanol producer is to capture the CO2 in the production of the ethanol. And so out west, or at least particularly in Iowa, there were 3 different pipeline projects. There's only one left. Summit is trying to connect all the a large series of ethanol plants so the CO2 isn't just put off. So if they can capture it and sequester it, and so they basically they're going to pump it to North Dakota and inject it in the bedrock, that would really lower a ethanol plant's carbon intensity score. Now, I know that, Peggy, there are plants, a few ethanol plants here in Ohio that they have already done the feasibility study on capturing and injecting their CO2. And that's an expensive premise. And I know with 40B, I think what I saw explained to me was there was about a 60 cent per bushel premium related to 40B. And in that case, theoretically, they thought the growers were going to get about a third of that. So that's 20 cents a bushel. 200 bushel corn, $40 an acre. I think with 45Z, the end potential is larger. So that's what I think has got the commodity groups somewhat excited. There's a little more there. There's a little more meat on the bone with 45Z.
And a related issue, and I see Eric Romick is on. Eric and I have been talking about this, following this. A related issue is, rather than trying to send that carbon to North Dakota, there are a lot of issues with that, is trying to have legal certainty in Ohio that it could be injected here in Ohio. Right now, our law doesn't allow for that. And there is uncertainty over, if you do inject carbon, who actually owns it, who owns the pore space in which you could inject it into. Is that a separate property interest, or is that just a natural property interest that correlates with the surface ownership? So there's legislation under consideration. I don't think the final version has been officially introduced yet, but it will all relate to this issue of what is called carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilization and storage, different terms used. But that's another thing that I think we're going to see coming because of these tax credits and the sustainable aviation fuels and bringing those CI scores down. They need to do something with that carbon. And that is a solution that it appears we're going to have a discussion on in the legislature, whether that can happen here in Ohio.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting and intriguing, but it's expensive too. And so I Brad Moffett with the corn growers, he's their ethanol person, and I just asked, well, what's the cost to build a? So you make the ethanol, it's got a low CI score. Some folks are considering building further refining adjacent to an ethanol plant. And so at scale, 100 million gallon ethanol plant, I think there's 4 or 5 of those in Ohio now. But the further refining facilities are about $1 billion investment. And I think, Peggy, and I know politics kind of gets interwoven in all of this, and it's a shame. It's just, this fall, I think companies are really hesitant, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens November 5th, because this could all just kind of, I just come out and say it. I'm really, I look at the parties right now. I mean, we just got a farm bill that was introduced last week from the, Chairman Thompson, and my God, I never seen a farm bill so big, and they have to pay for that somehow. Well, they're going to call money out of, the Inflation Reduction Act that was targeted for climate smart ag. So they want to drag some of that out. And if former President Trump is elected president, I just think some of this it's not going to be his highest priority. I mean, he's more into the, fossil fuel industry. So some of this might, so I think that's got investors kind of worried. They want to see the results of the election this fall before they make $1 billion investment in a refinery that's going to make sustainable aviation fuel. So, yeah. But a little on carbon intensity, I don't think what I call our consumer packaged goods companies, that's folks that are, buying the raw commodities and making them into food products, further processed. There still may be a lot of interest and a lot of, how should I say this? Incentive to commodity growers and farmers in general to know what their carbon intensity score is. I think you look at, like, I'll use PepsiCo for an example. I didn't really realize, they own Frito-Lay. And I didn't know how many snack food companies, especially snack foods, but they're working with currently about 6,000 potato growers across the globe to do just that, lower their carbon intensity score so that they can advertise a lower carbon footprint potato chip. I was in Minnesota this winter, spoke there. The farm family that invited me, they grow sugar beets, and those sugar beets the sugar is used by Pepsi in their cola products. And so they were generating a carbon intensity score there. And it's not that Pepsi was actually using the actual sugar made by that farmer's sugar beets. Pepsi wanted their data. And so they just basically give them their tillage, their nitrogen use, their herbicide use. And so that data then is used to then lower the carbon footprint of a bottle or a can of Pepsi. So it's not like these companies are actually going and buying, someone's particular beets and making it into sugar to make it into soda. It's all data. It's data flow. And that's what they want. They want the data. So, yeah. So as long as those folks still want to play in the lower carbon footprint arena, I don't think carbon intensity is going to go away, regardless of what happens in the fall.
Yeah. Whoever thought we'd be talking about low carbon potato chips.
Yeah.
You never know what's around the corner, do you?
I think most people would just like to have a lower price at the grocery store.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. I guess when you have to think about this is, consumer demand for it. I have yet to hear anyone at the meat counter saying, I want low carbon chicken or low carbon beef. I mean, there is a segment of population out there that have higher amounts of disposable income that shop a little more with environmental intent. That's why Whole Foods is what it is, or Trader Joe's is what it is. But eventually somebody's got to pay for all this, and it's going to be the consumer. So eventually, so that's where we're at. Someone's going to eventually have to do it.
There's a comment from Matt there, Dan. Did
Yeah.
you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to go ahead and read those. So Matt Kleinhens did comment that potato production has a very high carbon footprint, and potato production for processing markets, including chips, also includes very tight connections between the grower, the buyer, which makes coordinated on-farm practices a bit more possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to mention, sorry to jump in, that when you talk about potato production at scale, you have a very small number of players, and in terms of who is buying the raw potatoes and for what end use.
Yeah.
That is not to my knowledge, that is not true in the agronomic world.
Yeah.
So when you have somebody step in like Frito-Lay, McCain Foods International, ConAgra, JR Simplot, they can literally roll out a program with their buyers because everything is a contract.
Yeah.
There's hardly any, well, there's some open market grown potatoes, but most of those processing potatoes are sold before they're grown. So it makes it more possible to link, on-farm practices with promotion and marketing.
Yeah.
And that's possibly why we're seeing this kind of entry into the low carbon footprint potato chip, which is obviously really recognizable as a product and so on. So just wanted to add that context.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, you're right. And it's the same way with the sugar beets with Pepsi. Those are all contract sugar beets. You contract the acres. You don't just take them down there and throw them in the pile and get paid by the pound. Yeah, it's a contract. So that's kind of what I have for this morning. I don't, Peggy, you want to have anything else you want to share?
Well, I think so many of your comments lead to the legal part. I mean, it is that you started off talking about the carbon market and where it is and how it's changed in the last few years, just from when we first started hearing about carbon farming. And I think that volatility in the market has had a chilling effect basically on these carbon credit agreements, and has instead spurred interest in just doing the carbon programs that pay for creating or for doing the practice rather than creating a carbon credit. I'm just really not hearing a lot from farmers who are willing to go there yet. And part of that is the price, I'm sure. We really haven't seen, from the very little bit that we know, which, as you pointed out, it's not a transparent market. We just haven't seen sufficient financial incentives, it seems, to participate in the carbon credit agreement, as opposed to just going into one of the programs, doing the practice, knowing what you're going to be paid. There's just a lot more certainty in that approach. So that's very much connected to, I think, what I think about on the legal side. If folks aren't engaging in these agreements as much as we thought they would be, then I'm actually I'm a little bit relieved, because I have some legal concerns about them. So Dan, I don't know how much time you want us to go on. I know you said you have other you have more of your meeting that you need to conduct.
Yeah, we just have a few more topics on the agenda. A lot of has to do with kind of a business and certain updates, but I think this is a good time to open up the questions if you're both okay with that.
Sure, yeah. We'd love to hear what everyone's thinking about or questioning.
Well, I kind of jotted down a couple questions. Mike, you brought up the international market. How much of a barrier it is for an international market to have a contract with an American farmer? It just implementing these practices and then just kind of translating that to global scale. I mean, it's I guess in theory it's international trade, but at the same time, I just feel like it would be a little bit easier to implement. So, would these international companies have an influence on somebody doing, like you said, no-till, cover crops, and nitrogen stabilizers? That maybe that they've always done.
Well, the EU is like 20 years ahead of us on all this. So you go into a grocery store or a market in Brussels and you can pick up a product and it's going to have a carbon score on the packaging. So, again, EU, the European Green Deal, it's been around a while. Now there's been some say resistance to, if you follow the news a little bit this past summer, there were a lot of farmer protests in Europe related to more tightening down of regulations in Europe. So I think the EU has kind of backed off a little bit on some of the regulations related to agricultural production in Europe. A lot of that came as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, because the price of energy went up. We saw disruption of the commodities out of Ukraine. And so I think farmers there were, again, it was kind of complicated. Now, as it relates to us producing something here in the United States for international trade and a carbon score, we see that, but the aviation fuel is part of Europe. The EU has, I'm not sure the date, but there is a provision that international flights from the United States into Europe, I think the number is you have to be able to document that 25% of your fuel is sustainable aviation fuel if you're going to fly into European airports. And that's why you see the companies here wanting to be able to put that type of fuel in their planes. They don't want to lose their international markets. So that's kind of what's driven part of that. So yeah, it was a European requirement that 25% of your fuel is going to be sustainable. And that's why now we see Delta and everyone else coming to the corn growers. They were at the Commodity Classic. They had a booth. I mean, that's kind of, they're trying to get growers and American ag into sustainable aviation fuel.
Wow. All right, thank you. Other questions? Yeah. Well, I guess I'm not hearing anything. I just got one more. I don't want to take up all your time. I feel bad about asking all the questions, but we hear a lot about in dairies, how they're capturing the methane and using them to power their equipment. You talk about carbon offsets and insets, right? It just seems to me, when you're talking about these programs and these practices, a lot of these dairies I have implemented, this methane capture system, which I think would translate into carbon as well, but it would definitely offset the carbon footprint. They'd be set up in a really good situation, I think. I don't know if the dairy industry is promoting that a lot or looking into that, as far as these large dairies that have all these insets and offset capabilities, if you're seeing movement in that sector.
I'll talk on the production side. I want Peggy to talk about methane digesters because there's something going on with that too. But here in Ohio, I guess MVP Dairy, Van Tilburg's folks over in Salina, that's an organic dairy, large dairy. They're working with Danone there in Minster. I ran into who worked for us, and I remember the name. He's now their person, was an extension agent. Anyway, I ran into him a couple weeks ago. Again, that production's they're using cover crops, they're using no-till, they're judicious with their manure management, using manure as a nitrogen source. So again, and that's, Danone wants to have a sustainable yogurt product. So that's out there. I want to talk a little bit about some other current technology. There are some dairies, one in particular in Indiana, I think it's Prairie View. Don DeYoung is the owner of this. They manage a lot of cows across the United States. Again, this is their organic division. They've got a system that's called a VACOR system. And I don't know exactly how I would describe this. It came out of the wastewater treatment industry. They basically now, as they flush their barns out, they use a system, and it's an expensive system, that all the liquid manure goes through a set of filters, and then they filter out all the solids. Those solids are then dried. And at the end, they get three products that come out of this system. They get a dry pathogen-free manure. They get potable water, and they get an aqueous nitrogen solution. So they're filtering out the nitrogen, the water, and the solids. And so then what they do is they can use the water, they can use it for paddle water, they can use it to flush, they can use it to irrigate. They get a dry manure product, and they get a nitrogen product they can use in their corn production system. So again, lowering the amount of carbon-based energy that they use, fertilizer, and so forth. So that's out there. And the other thing, California is probably the biggest buyer of, their California Emission Board. They have digesters all over the United States, and they clean the methane out of hog barns, dairy barns, Central Valley of California. And that methane and that gas then goes into a natural gas line. And those credits are generated for California. So, but I know Peggy and I have talked a little bit about communities and communities' attitudes towards CAFOs and large dairies. And I mean, there's talk on even digesters are not in favor, correct?
Yeah, there've been a couple of court cases on those, especially some that may not have been managed very well. And the nuisance impacts they create for the community. And right now, the current state of the law in Ohio is that that type of a biodigester is considered a public utility and therefore is exempt from local zoning authority. And so that's created a lot of consternation in those areas that have had to deal with some of the nuisance impacts of the biodigester. But it seems that, a lot of that, from what I can tell, is poor management and not necessarily something that we can assume that all biodigesters would do or have that same impact on their community. But right now, they can't be zoned out of a community unless it's in a city, which of course it most likely would not be.
All right, other questions?
Dan, could I just take a minute to talk about a couple other legal concerns in case anyone is talking with farmers about
Please.
carbon
Yes.
agreements? I just want to make a few quick points. One is, what's unusual, I think, about the carbon agreement approach and, creating the carbon credit is we're so accustomed in agriculture to having uniform systems of measurement. And, when we take our commodities to market, we know how much we created. We know we can verify that system of measurement. And that's certainly a major concern in these carbon credit agreements, that the measurement of that unit that we're to be paid for. There is no uniform system at this time. USDA is trying to create some guidelines, some standards that would address that. But right now, we're a ways off from that. So how do we know for sure what we created and who verifies that? Those are still two major concerns. The other big legal concern I have is the fact that we don't even know what kind of property interest this is when we create a carbon credit. Is it a personal property interest? Is it a real property interest? Does it attach to the land and lay there as a property interest, interest that can be transferred, traded? We don't know. There's no documentation of that property interest, even though there are in these agreements many requirements that they remain in place permanently. But there's no way to document that this credit has been generated and is laying there in the land. We don't have a property system that allows for recording and documenting that interest. And I think that's especially problematic for future landowners that take over that land. And, without their knowledge, there's just this private agreement that, hey, this carbon credit is to remain in place permanently. I just think we've really put the cart before the horse here, and we need some property law systems in place to address the carbon credit approach, which is why I really lean toward the adoption of practices approach as a way of a farmer participating in these climate smart markets. And then the third concern I want to raise is, so much of our land is under lease. And so if we have a tenant operator who wants to engage in a carbon credit program, that usually requires some type of consent by the landowner. But again, a lot of legal uncertainty over who's ultimately responsible for maintaining that credit that's been created. And many of our leases, if even in writing, don't address that. They don't address how we're going to deal with carbon within that leasing situation. So I think it's something that requires attention on the leasing end. These are all things that Mike and I are going to talk about, by the way, you want to tell them about the project that we're doing with Aaron Wilson, a grant project that Mike and I will be doing some training on this. Mike?
Sure. As part of a NIFA grant, looking at climate hubs, the Midwest Climate Hub, and all the extension systems within basically the North Central region. Peggy and I have been working on a teacher's guide. So we've got 9 of your fellow colleagues from around the state that have agreed to go through some additional training around soil health, carbon sequestration, and then what we're really excited about is carbon markets and carbon policy. So those 9 later this fall, early winter, will about a 3 days worth of training. And so they're going to be people that you can call upon. If you have a meeting, you want someone to do, talk about any of those 3 topics, you could call them in. If you have a field day, any type of program. So they're going to just
take any more, Mike, if anyone
how's
else?
that?
Can we take more if anyone else?
Yeah, we could take, if anyone's interested, we could take some
So.
more. Yeah, we have 9, but we would like to have a couple more. No problem.
It won't be
and I-
Boticher since he's leaving us, but
Yeah,
anyone else on
I
here?
think the closest ones for you all that I'm kind of looking here, it would be Kerry Brown from Fairfield County and Ed Brown from Athens, I know are in the cohort. Go north of you a little bit. Heather Newkirk is in the group. So we've got you kind of sandwiched. But yeah, they're just going to be resources that you could call in for whatever type of a program you'd like to do. So it's kind of train the trainer. So we're training some trainers. So
and then too, looking at where everyone here, the county educators are from too, Mike, I think, the one positive thing in this carbon credit market that I see is that some of the issues are overcome when we're talking about trees.
Yeah.
Versus grain crops. So those of you who are in those areas, you might see more interest in the credit agreements because we do have a little more certainty in that market when we're talking about sequestering by means of timber. So
Yep.
That's
Trees
all.
are the
That's all I
best.
have to say. That's all, Dan.
Oh,
Unless you
no,
have any other
thank-
questions.
No, this was very good. I jotted down a lot of good points that you made. Just before we wrap up with our program, any other questions? Then, if not, I'm going to stop the recording.